Her knees had stopped hurting around the 3rd mile. That was the part that scared her the most. Not the blood. Not the cold biting through what was left of her dress. Not the sound of her own breathing, ragged and wet, echoing off the stone-grey ground. It was the silence in her knees. The silence meant she was running out of things that could still feel. Lena kept moving. One hand. One knee. One hand. One knee. She had been counting fence posts since she crossed the border. There had been 12. Now there were 4 left between her and the iron gate at the far end of the courtyard, and she told herself she only needed to reach the next one. Not the gate. Not the guards standing motionless behind it with their long coats and their blank faces. Just the next post. Post 9. Post 8. The wind cut across the open ground and she felt the child shift inside her. A small, firm movement. Not a kick exactly. Something more like a reminder. She kept moving. There were things she had not let herself think about during the 3 days it had taken to reach this place. She had not thought about the village, because the village was gone. She had not thought about her mother, because her mother was gone too, and thinking about her now would stop her legs from walking, and her legs were the only thing she still had full control over. She had not thought about the man whose child she was carrying, because that was the most dangerous thought of all, and she needed to arrive at his gate alive before she could afford to be afraid of what came next. Post 7. The ground was not kind. It was uneven and half frozen, and twice she had gone down on both hands and had to push herself back up slowly, carefully, the way a person does when they are not entirely sure their arms will hold. They had held. She had a system. She was still moving. Post 6. One of the guards at the gate had shifted his weight. She saw it from a distance, that small adjustment, and she understood what it meant. They had seen her. Of course they had seen her. She was the only thing moving on the open ground between the border markers and their wall, a slow dark shape against pale dirt, and they had probably been watching her for the last 20 minutes. They had not moved to help her. That was fine. She had not come here for help. She had come here because there was nowhere else left that might keep the child alive, and she had made herself be honest about that while she still had the strength to make decisions. That was the word she used in her own head. Decisions. It sounded cleaner than the truth, which was that she had run out of every other option, and crawling to the enemy's gate was the only one remaining. Post 5. Her left hand landed on something sharp and she felt it open her palm and she did not look at it. Looking at it would make it real in a way that would slow her down. She had learned that in the 2nd hour, when her right knee had started leaving a thin trail behind her on the ground. She had not looked at that either. She had counted posts instead. Post 4. She was close enough now to see the faces of the guards more clearly. There were 3 of them. 2 young, 1 older, and it was the older one who was watching her with an expression she could not fully read from this distance. Not disgust. Not the eager cruelty she had been bracing for. Something more complicated. Something almost like conflict. She filed that away. Post 3. She heard one of the younger guards say something to the other, low and short. The other one did not respond. The older guard still had not moved. Lena kept her eyes on the ground directly in front of her hands and did not give them the sight of her face yet. Not yet. She would need her face to be the last thing she offered, because her face was the only remaining card she had, and she was going to play it at exactly the right moment. Post 2. Her arms were shaking now. Not visibly, she hoped, but she could feel it deep in the muscle, that fine trembling that meant the body was negotiating with itself about how much further it was willing to go. She made the decision for it. Further. You are going further. You are going until there is a gate in front of your hands instead of ground. Post 1. She stopped. She sat back on her heels, very slowly, and raised her head, and looked at the gate. The older guard was looking back at her. His hand was not on his weapon. That was the first thing she noted. The second thing she noted was that he had recognized her. She could see it happen, That sudden stillness that moves across a person's face when they see something they were not expecting, something that changes the shape of the next several minutes in a way they have not prepared for. He knew her clan markings. The circles on her wrist, dark against her skin, worn there since she was 8 years old. Every one of the Alpha King soldiers had been given a description of those markings. She knew this because the order had been read aloud publicly, 3 years ago, on the same afternoon the village burned. Wipe them from the earth. She held the guard's gaze and did not look away, and she placed one hand flat against the ground in front of the gate, and she felt the child move again, and she said, quietly and clearly and without any trembling in her voice at all, "I need to see the king." Nobody moved. The wind pushed across the courtyard and somewhere behind the walls a door opened and closed. The older guard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the markings on her wrist. Then he looked at the rest of her, at the state of her, at 3 days of open ground written all over her body, and something shifted in his expression that she was not expecting. He took one step back from the gate. He looked at the young guard on his left and said a single word, low enough that Lena could not hear it. The young guard walked away quickly, disappearing through the interior door. The older guard looked back at her. He did not open the gate yet. But he had sent for someone. She did not know what that meant. She knew only that her hands were still on the ground, that the child was still moving, and that she had made it to the post. She had made it to the post. She let herself breathe. Just once. Just one real, full breath, the kind she had not allowed herself in 3 days because real breaths were the kind that came with thoughts attached to them, and thoughts were expensive, and she had been running a very tight economy. The gate did not open. Not yet. But the older guard was still standing there, and he had not called anyone to remove her, and in the entire long catalogue of things she had imagined happening when she reached this gate, that was the outcome she had assigned the lowest probability to. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had gotten very good at it. The child shifted again, and she pressed her free hand flat against her side, very gently, and she did not say anything out loud. There was nothing to say out loud. The conversation she needed to have was on the other side of that gate, in a room she had never been inside, with a man she had not seen in 2 years and had not spoken to in 3. The door opened again in the interior wall. 2 guards came through it, and then a third person behind them, and Lena looked up and saw the older guard watching her face very carefully as the third person came into view, and she understood that he was watching for her reaction, cataloging it, storing it for a report he would write later. She kept her face still. The third person was not the king. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat with a small insignia at the collar. She walked to the gate and looked through it at Lena with eyes that moved quickly and professionally over everything they saw, and when she was finished looking she reached into her coat and pulled out a small ring of keys. She opened the gate. She did not say welcome. She did not say anything at all, which Lena respected. She simply stepped back and made room, and the 2 guards came forward, and Lena felt hands close carefully around her arms, lifting her, and she let them lift her because she had run out of the kind of strength that resists being lifted. She was upright. She had not been upright in 3 days. The courtyard was larger than it had looked from the ground. There were lights in the windows of the main building ahead of her, warm yellow light spilling out onto the stone, and she could see her shadow thrown long across the ground in front of her, and she thought for one strange moment that her shadow looked like someone who still had somewhere to be. She held on to that thought. She walked forward. The woman with the key stayed 3 steps ahead of her, not looking back, moving at a pace that was just slow enough for Lena to keep up with. The guard stayed at her sides, not gripping her, just present. Lena noted all of this and fired it and kept walking. The main door opened before they reached it. Inside, the warmth hit her like something solid. She had not been warm in 3 days either, and her body's first response to the heat was a deep, involuntary shudder that went through her from her feet to her shoulders, and one of the guards shifted slightly as though he was going to catch her, and she straightened before he could. The entrance hall was wide and tall, lit by iron fixtures along the walls. There were 2 men in long coats standing near the far end of it, and they both turned to look at her when she entered, and she saw their faces go through several things in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, uncertainty, and then the careful blankness of people who have been trained to control what their faces show. They knew her markings too. The woman with the keys turned to her at last and said, in a flat, even tone, "He knows you are here. You will wait." Lena nodded once. The woman gestured toward a chair against the wall. Lena considered it. She thought about what it would mean to sit down, whether her body would cooperate with standing up again if she did, whether the judgment involved in that calculation was sound given everything her body had been through. She sat down. The warmth kept coming and she let it come, and she kept her hands folded in her lap and her face pointed at the door at the far end of the hall, and she waited, because waiting was what she had left, and she was very, very good at it. Somewhere inside the building, footsteps crossed the floor and stopped. Then the door at the far end of the hall opened. And Lena looked up. The room fell quiet before he reached the doorway. Lena noticed that first. Not the man himself, but the way silence arrived ahead of him, rolling through the entrance hall, the way cold air rolls in under a door, pressing against everything and changing the atmosphere before you can see the source. The two men in long coats went very still. The woman with the keys took one small step backward. Even the guards at Lena's side adjusted their weight in some unconscious way, a slight squaring of the shoulders that was not quite attention and was not quite fear, but was something in between. Then he was in the doorway. Cole Mercer. Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, ruler of the largest wolf territory on the continent, the man responsible for 3 wars in 5 years and the elimination of 4 rival clans. Lena had heard him described in many ways over the past 3 years. Ruthless. Brilliant. Dangerous in the particular way that very intelligent people are dangerous, which is that they are always 3 steps ahead and they let you know it. Cold. Controlled. The kind of man whose anger you never see coming because he has already finished being angry by the time you realize you have made him that way. She had heard all of this. She had not heard anyone describe the way he filled a doorway. He was tall, broader than she had remembered, and the years had done something to his face that made it harder to look at directly. Not harder in a bad way. Harder in the way that looking at something very bright is hard. He was wearing a dark shirt and a coat that had seen recent use, and his eyes moved to her immediately, as though he had known exactly where she would be sitting, as though he had placed her there himself. Those eyes did not move away. Lena met them. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the guards. She did not perform the kind of submission that the situation technically called for, a woman of a destroyed enemy clan sitting injured in the entrance hall of the man who had ordered that destruction, arriving without invitation, carrying what she was carrying. She looked at him. His face showed her nothing, and she showed him nothing back, and for a moment the whole entrance hall was just the two of them looking at each other across 10 feet of warm stone floor with the history of the last 3 years sitting between them like a third person in the room. Then he walked forward. He crossed the hall without hurrying, and he stopped 2 feet in front of her, and he looked at her in a way that was careful and complete, the way a person looks at something they need to understand fully before they make a decision about it. She held very still under that look. She understood its purpose and she let it finish. He looked at her wrist. At the markings. Something happened in his face then, something so small and so quickly controlled that she almost missed it, but she had been watching very carefully and she did not miss it. A tightening around the eyes. A single moment of something that was not the cold calculation she had braced herself for. It was gone before she could be certain she had seen it. He looked back at her face. "Lena Holt," he said. His voice was exactly the same. That surprised her. Everything else had changed, the room, the years, the fact of his guard standing at her back and hers being gone from the earth entirely, but his voice was exactly the same as it had been the last time she had heard it, and she had to work harder than she expected to keep her face still. "Cole Mercer," she said. Somewhere to his left, one of the men in long coats made a sound. Not quite a word. Just a sound, the kind that signals that the person making it has a strong opinion about what is currently happening and is attempting to signal that opinion diplomatically. Cole did not look at him. He kept looking at Lena, and after a moment he said, very quietly, "How long were you on the ground?" She had not expected that question. She had prepared for many questions. Not that one. 3 days, she said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his head and looked at the woman with the keys, and he said one word. Just one word, low and clear, and the woman moved immediately, gesturing to the guards, and Lena heard doors opening further into the building. Then he looked back at her, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not softness exactly. She would not have called it softness. It was more like the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they have been thinking about for a very long time and are now finally looking at directly. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She stood up. The warmth and the sitting had done something to her legs that made standing complicated, and she managed it, but there was a moment, a single visible moment, where it was not clean. Where she had to put one hand on the arm of the chair and push. Cole did not move during that moment, and he did not look away, and he did not offer his hand, which she understood was its own kind of courtesy. She stood. She faced him. And then she said the thing she had been rehearsing for 3 days of ground and code and counting fence posts, the thing she had stripped down to its smallest and most precise form because she understood that precision was the only currency she had left to spend. "I am not asking for myself," she said. "I am asking for the child. Whatever you decide to do with me, I am asking you to let the child live." The entrance hall was very quiet. The man in the long coat on the left moved. He stepped forward and opened his mouth, and Cole's hand came up, just one hand, held out to the side, palm down, and the man stopped moving. Stopped mid-step. The hand came back down. Cole looked at Lena for a long, still moment. Then he did something that nobody in the room was expecting. He went down on one knee. Right there on the stone floor of the entrance hall, in front of his guard and his advisor and the woman with the keys and whatever history was written on the walls of this place, Cole Massa put one knee on the ground, and he looked up at her, and he said, quietly and clearly, "No one here will touch either of you." Nobody moved. Somewhere in the building, a fire crackled in a grate. Lena looked at him, at the top of his head and then at his face when he tilted it up to hold her gaze, and she felt something shift inside her that she had been keeping very locked and very still for 3 days, and she tightened every door she had and kept her face exactly as it was. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. He rose. He turned and walked toward the inner door, and the guards moved, and the woman with the keys moved, and everything in the entrance hall began moving around Lena the way water moves around a stone, and she stood in the middle of it and breathed. Just breathe. The child moved. She pressed her hand to her side, that same small gesture, and she walked forward into whatever came next. She had not expected to sleep. The room they gave her was on the second floor of the east wing, away from the main hall, with a window that looked out over a stone courtyard and, beyond the courtyard walls, a long stretch of dark hills. The bed was wide and the blankets were heavy and someone had left a tray of food on the table near the window, plain food, bread and warm soup and a cup of something that smelled like it had herbs in it, and she had eaten all of it slowly and carefully, the way a person eats when they have not eaten properly in 3 days and do not entirely trust their body's enthusiasm. Then she had sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the window, and the window had gone dark, and at some point between the dark window and the next thought she intended to have, she had been unconscious. She slept for 14 hours. She woke to pale light and the distant sound of the compound coming alive around her, boots on stone corridors, voices in the courtyard below, the particular rhythm of a place that is always operational, always awake in some part of itself even when the rest is sleeping. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, cataloging the sounds the way she cataloged everything, because cataloging things was how she had stayed alive for 3 years, and she was not ready to stop doing it. Then she got up. There was a basin of water near the window and she used it, and there were clothes folded on the chair that had not been there when she had eaten. Someone had come in while she slept and she had not woken up, which told her things about the state she had been in, things she did not enjoy knowing. The clothes were plain and a good size and she put them on and stood at the window and looked at the courtyard below. 2 guards, switching positions at the gate. A man carrying a crate of something across the far end. A woman with short gray hair and a purposeful walk disappearing through a side door. Everything moving. Everything working. She pressed her fingers to the glass and felt the cold of it and thought, this place has been working this whole time. While her village was ash and her people were scattered, this place had been working. The guards had changed shifts and the food had been brought in and the fires had been lit every morning, and the man who ordered what happened to her village had slept well and risen early and walked through these corridors making decisions. She was very careful with that thought. She picked it up and looked at it the way she looked at things that could hurt her, and she set it aside in a place where it would not interfere with what she needed to do next. What she needed to do next was talk to Cole Mercer. Not the conversation from the entrance hall. That conversation had been about survival, about getting through the gate and establishing that she and the child were not going to be removed from the building in the night. That part had been accomplished. The next conversation was a different kind of conversation, and she needed to be clear in her own mind about what she wanted from it before she walked into it. She wanted the child to be safe. That was the only thing. She had been very precise with herself about this, in the long quiet hours of the crawl, when there had been nothing to do but be precise. She was not here for herself. She was not here to negotiate, or to make accusations, or to ask for explanations that would not change anything that had already happened. She was here for the child, because the child had not had any say in being brought into this particular situation, and that was her fault, and she intended to fix it with whatever she had left to offer. The door knocked. She turned from the window. "Come in," she said. The woman who entered was not the woman with the keys from the night before. This one was younger, perhaps 30, with a direct expression and a medical bag over one shoulder. She introduced herself as Faye, gave no last name, and said she had been asked to look at Lena's hands and knees, with Lena's permission. Lena gave it. Faye walked with the efficient, non-intrusive manner of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has learned that people do not enjoy being asked unnecessary questions while being examined. She cleaned and dressed the cuts, noted the state of Lena's knees with a slight tightening of her mouth that she did not allow to become a comment, and took Lena's pulse with 2 fingers and a clock and said the word "good" once, to herself, in a tone that suggested it had been a closer thing than good. Then she checked the child. She did this with a quiet thoroughness that made Lena feel, for the first time in 3 days, something that might have been relief. Real relief, the kind that is not about your own survival but about the survival of something that matters more to you than your own survival. "Strong," Faye said, and there was something genuine in her voice when she said it. Lena exhaled. Faye packed her bag and said that someone would bring food shortly and that Lena should not stand for more than an hour at a time today, and Lena nodded at all of this without fully hearing it because the word "strong" was still in the room, taking up space. Faye left. Lena sat in the chair by the window and looked at the hills and let herself have the relief for exactly 3 minutes, and then she put it away and went back to thinking about the next conversation. He came that afternoon. She heard his steps in the corridor before the knock, because she had been listening, and she had learned his footfall in the 12 hours since she had arrived, the particular weight of it, the pace. He knocked once and waited, which surprised her. She had not expected him to knock. "Come in," she said. He came in alone. No guards at his back, no advisor, no woman with keys. He closed the door behind him and stood near it for a moment, taking in the room, looking at her in the chair by the window, and she looked back at him in the afternoon light and thought that the years showed on him in ways they had not shown in the entrance hall, where the emotion of the moment had made it hard to look at him carefully. He was tired. Not in the way that a single night's bad sleep makes a person tired. In the way that years of a certain kind of work make a person tired, a permanent tiredness that lives in the line of the jaw and the set of the shoulders, that does not go away with rest because it is not made of rest deprivation. He took the chair across from her without being invited and without asking, and she did not comment on that because she had no grounds to. For a moment neither of them spoke. The room held a silence in a way that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unbearable, somewhere in the middle, the particular silence of 2 people who have a large amount of history between them and no clean place to begin. He said, "How far did you walk?" "About 60 miles, she said. "The last 3 on the ground." He looked at his hands. His jaw moved once. "There was no one left," she said. Not as an accusation. As a fact. "I was the only one who made it out of the valley." He looked up. "I know," he said. 2 words. Very quiet. She looked at him when he said them and she thought about what it meant that he had said it that way, without defense or explanation, just acknowledgement, bare and direct, and she thought about the order she had found 3 months later in the rubble of the nearest checkpoint, the one with his name on it but not his signature, the one that would have finished the job and never had. She had not shown him that she knew about that order yet. She was not going to show him today. Today was about establishing ground. About making sure the conversation they were eventually going to have could happen in a place where they could both be honest about what they were, and what had happened, and what they intended to do about the child that was going to arrive in approximately 6 weeks and change everything. I need to know if this is permanent, she said. The safety you offered last night. I need to know if it holds. He held her gaze. It holds, he said. Even if your advisors disagree. Yes. She looked at him. He was not a man who qualified his statements. She remembered that about him, and she remembered that she had once found it reassuring and once found it terrifying, sometimes in the same afternoon. She nodded once. Then we should talk about the rest, she said. We should, he said. Outside the window, the hills were beginning to go blue at the edges as the afternoon moved toward evening. Somewhere in the building, the rhythm of boots on stone kept going, the compound walking, always walking. Lena kept her hands folded in her lap and looked at the man across from her and thought about the 60 miles, and the fence post, and the moment the gate had swung open, and the word strong, and all the decisions she had made to arrive in this chair. She said, he will need a name. Cole looked at her. A slow breath moved through him. Lena said quietly, and she watched something cross his face and settle there, something that stayed this time, that did not get controlled away. He said. The room was very still. Outside, the hills went blue. If the palace had expected the king to send the woman away quietly, it had underestimated how long Cole Massa had been making decisions that his court did not expect. His chief advisor was a man named Douglas Hale. 20 years in service, sharp in the way that men who have survived several different regimes become sharp, careful with language and faster than anyone expected when he needed to move. He appeared at Cole's office the morning after Lena's arrival with a cup of strong tea he had not been asked to bring and a face arranged into the expression of someone raising a concern they consider themselves professionally obligated to raise. Cole let him talk. Douglas talked for 6 minutes. He mentioned the optics. He mentioned the 3 packs who shared a border. He mentioned the remaining members of Lena's clan who had scattered into the outlying territories and were watched but not pursued, a decision that Cole had made 18 months ago and that Douglas had also raised concerns about at the time. He mentioned the general mood of the nobility. He used the phrase, not insurmountable, twice, which Cole had learned over 20 years meant Douglas considered it very nearly insurmountable. When Douglas finished, Cole said, she stays. Douglas looked at him. She and the child both stay, Cole said. Arrange a physician from the village who has no connection to the advisory house. Arrange whatever the physician says she needs. And tell the house steward that her room is to be treated with the same privacy as mine. Douglas was quiet for a moment. The northern houses will move, he said. When they find out. They will move when they find out, Cole said. And when they move, we will know which of them was looking for a reason. Douglas looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone revising an assessment. You have thought about this, Douglas said. I have thought about very little else for 2 years, Cole said. Douglas took his tea and left. Cole stood at the window of his office and watched the courtyard below, where the morning shift was moving through their drills with the mechanical efficiency of people who had been trained to the point where training had become instinct. He watched them and thought about what Douglas had said, and he thought about the look on Lena's face the morning before, not the careful controlled look she had worn in the entrance hall, but the one she had worn the second before she sat down in the chair by the window, when she had thought no one was watching. He had been watching. He had been watching Lena Holt for 3 years without being able to do anything about it, and the fact of that sat in him the way facts that are too large to be useful sit in a person, taking up space, resisting examination. He left the office. She was in the corridor. He had not been told she was leaving her room, And for a fraction of a second something moved through him that was adjacent to alarm before he processed what he was seeing. She was walking, carefully and steadily, one hand on the wall at her side, not for balance exactly, more the way a person keeps one hand on a railing because the railing is there. She had found the archive corridor. She did not know he was behind her. He watched her stop in front of the document cases. She was not browsing. She went directly to a particular section, the third case from the left, the second shelf from the bottom, and he understood from the precision of it that she had been told where this was, or had calculated where it would be, and that the direction of her steps in the corridor had been entirely deliberate. He watched her open the case. He watched her hands go still. He knew what she had found. He had known she would find it eventually, had wondered for months what she would do when she did. He stayed in the doorway and he watched her lift the document and read it, or read enough of it to know what it was, and then he watched her face do something complicated and private that she had no idea he was seeing. She turned around. She saw him. For a moment the corridor was just the two of them and the document in her hands and 3 years of things that had not been said. She walked to him. She held out the document. He looked at it. He did not take it. She held his gaze and then she looked down at the document in her hands, and she did not fold it, she did not make it small, she took it in both hands and she tore it cleanly in half. Then she tore it again. Then she set the pieces in the document case and closed the case. She looked at him. Her face was doing something that was not quite what he would have expected, not relief, not accusation, not forgiveness because she had not decided yet whether she was in the business of forgiving. It was more like a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just decided to set it down. Not because the weight is gone, but because they are done carrying it in the old way. He looked at her. He thought about saying something and he did not say it. She walked past him, back toward the east wing, her hand returning to the wall as she went. He stood in the corridor for a long time. The document case sat closed behind him. The pieces inside it sat where she had put them. He turned and looked at the case and thought about the night he had written that order and the next morning when he had not sent it, and the particular kind of recklessness that had been, and the particular kind of cost it had carried. What it, he thought. The same thing he had thought every time, in the 2 years since. What it. Outside the archive windows, the late afternoon had begun to pull the light off the hills, leaving them dark and clear against the pale sky, and the compound kept moving, because it always kept moving, and somewhere in the east wing a door closed quietly. He went back to work. The weeks passed in the particular way that weeks pass when the present moment is too large for ordinary time to contain it. They passed quickly in their days and slowly in their hours. Lena's body healed, and the child grew, and the compound went on around both of these things with the steady indifference of a place that has its own purposes. But it was not indifferent. Cole saw it, even if she did not. The way Faye stayed later than she needed to at the morning checkups, sitting an extra 10 minutes, talking about ordinary things, the weather, the herb garden at the east gate, the sound the wind made when it came through the valley. The way the kitchen began sending things up to the east wind that had not been asked for, specific things, the kind of food that required someone to have paid attention to what Lena had eaten and what she had left. The way the older guard from the gate, whose name was Owen, had begun appearing in the courtyard below her window at approximately the same time each morning, never looking up, but present. The compound was a living thing, and living things respond to the presence of other living things. Douglas responded to all of this by writing more memos. The memos were about the northern houses, about what Douglas was hearing from the border territories, about the increasing volume of interest in the east wing and its occupant. They were well-written memos. Cole read them all and acted on approximately a third of them, the third that described genuine strategic concerns rather than the ambient discomfort of people who had decided to have opinions about something that was not their business. He was in the middle of the 4th week when the message arrived from Lord Adrian Voss. Adrian Voss led the largest of the northern park houses, the one that shared the longest border with Cole's territory and had been watching that border with increasing attention since the end of the last war. He was the kind of man who did not make threats because he had enough resources to not need threats. He made requests. The request was written in the carefully neutral language of diplomatic correspondence, which made its content unmistakable. The woman and the child constituted a destabilizing presence. Certain parties were concerned. Certain parties would welcome a resolution. Certain parties had, in the event that no resolution was forthcoming, begun to have conversations with other parties who shared their concerns. Cole put the letter down. He picked it up again. He read the last line a second time, the line about other parties who shared their concerns, because that was the line that mattered, that was the line that had teeth in it, that was the line that meant Voss was not operating alone and had not been operating alone for some time. He called for Douglas. Douglas arrived with another cup of tea he had not been asked for and the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular conversation and is relieved it has finally arrived. How long has Voss been talking to them? Cole asked. 3 weeks, perhaps 4, Douglas said. I have been uncertain how to bring it up. You bring it up by coming to my office and saying Lord Voss has been talking to other houses about removing a civilian from my protection. Douglas absorbed this. They are not talking about removing her, Douglas said carefully. They are talking about your judgment. Cole looked at him. My judgment, he said. Your judgment in protecting someone who represents a political liability, Douglas said. There is a difference between the thing they will do and the argument they will use. Cole was quiet for a moment. How many houses, he said. 4, at the moment. Possibly 5. And foreign contacts. Douglas paused. 1, he said. Park Hargrove, to the east. Cole stood up. He walked to the window and looked at the courtyard and thought about the thing Douglas had just said, and thought about the document case in the archive corridor with its torn pieces, and thought about Faye's expression when she said the word strong, and thought about 60 miles and 3 days on the ground and a woman counting fence posts. He thought about all of it. He turned around. Send me the record of who attended the last 3 council sessions, he said. Douglas frowned. What are you looking for? I am looking for Douglas Hale, Cole said. Specifically, I am looking for what Douglas Hale told 3 people at the last council session that he has not told me. The room was very quiet. Douglas put his tea down. The council met on the 58th day. It was a formal session, which meant everyone was present and in their designated positions around the long table, the advisory seats along one side, the military seats along the other, the heads of the 3 household departments at the far end. Cole sat at the near end, which was the position that in any other room would have been called the head of the table, but in this room was called the seat, a small distinction that had been important to someone at some point and had stayed. Douglas sat at Cole's right. The session began with routine matters. Border reports. A water rights dispute in the southern reach that had been ongoing for 2 months. A weather concern from the farming territories that affected the next quarter's supply estimates. Cole moved through these things efficiently and without comment beyond what was needed, and the room settled into the familiar rhythm of functional administration. Then Douglas put a document on the table. It was a formal petition. Cole recognized the format. The format was used when a group of council members wished to request a formal response from the king on a matter of policy, a mechanism that existed for legitimate governance purposes and that had not been invoked in this council in 11 years. Cole looked at the document. He looked at Douglas. Douglas looked back at him with the careful expression of a man who has made a decision he believes is correct and is about to find out if he was wrong. Cole picked up the document. He read it. It took him 4 minutes. The room stayed silent throughout those 4 minutes with the particular quality of silence that exists when every person in a room knows that what happens next will matter, and is waiting to see what happens next. Cole put the document down. He looked at Douglas. He said, "You wrote this." Douglas said, "I organized it. Multiple members contributed." "You wrote it," Cole said. "The phrasing in the 3rd paragraph is yours." "I know your phrasing, Douglas. I have been reading your phrasing for 20 years. Douglas said nothing. Cole looked at the room. He looked at each person at the table, one at a time, slowly, and he noted the ones who met his gaze and the ones who did not, and he made a count in his head of both categories, and the count matched what he had expected based on the session attendance records he had reviewed the night before. Then he said, "Douglas Hale." Just the name. Nothing else. The room went very still. "I want you to stand up," Cole said. Douglas stood. Cole looked at him. He said, clearly and without any inflection of anger, because he had finished being angry about this some hours ago, "I am removing you from the advisory council on the grounds of contact made with Lord Voss and Park Hargrove without my knowledge or authorization. The contact was intended to build a case against a decision made under my authority and to invite external pressure to reverse it. That is not counsel. That is the other thing. You know the name for it." Douglas's face showed him something. Not guilt. Douglas was too experienced for visible guilt. Something more like a man who has rolled a calculation and found it came out less favorably than anticipated. He said, "I was acting in the interest of the territory." "You were acting in the interest of what you believe the territory should want," Cole said. "That is different. I decide what the territory wants. That is the arrangement." He looked at the guard at the door and made a small gesture, and the guard moved. The room watched Douglas Hale leave. When the door closed, Cole looked at the remaining council and said, "Voss and Hargrove will move. Possibly 2 others." He put both hands flat on the table. "I need to know what each of you is prepared to offer when they do." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the military attaché at the far end of the table, a quiet woman named Ruth who had served through 2 of the 3 recent wars and whose opinion Cole trusted more than anyone else in the room, said, "All of it." She said it simply, without ceremony, looking at him. "All of it," she said again. "Whatever you need." And after a moment, around the table, the voices joined hers. Cole looked at the window. Outside, the late afternoon light sat on the hills. He thought about Lena in the East Wing, probably at the window herself, watching the same light. He thought about what he had said to Douglas about what the territory wants. He turned back to the room and said, "Then let us begin." They came on the 40th day after the council session. 3 packs, not 4, because Cole had made a particular approach to the 4th house the week before, an approach involving information about a debt that the 4th house would have preferred to remain private, and the 4th house had considered its options and declined the Voss invitation. Park Hargrove came from the east. Voss came from the north. A smaller pack whose name Cole had not bothered to learn but whose desire for opportunity was well documented came from the western ridge. They did not come quietly. That was Voss's decision, Cole thought. Voss was the kind of man who believed that a show of force made a negotiation unnecessary, that if you arrived with enough weight behind you, the thing you wanted would simply be provided to avoid the unpleasantness of what came next. It was a strategy that worked frequently enough to remain popular. It had certain known failure modes. The first failure mode was the one where the person you came to intimidate had been expecting you for 6 weeks and had made specific and thorough preparations. Ruth had been managing those preparations since the council session. Cole trusted Ruth. The battle, when it came, lasted 4 days. 3 on the northern and eastern borders, where the terrain was difficult and the defensive positions Ruth had selected made forward movement expensive for Voss and Hargrove, and 1 day in the west where the smaller pack from the ridge reached the outer wall of the compound, which was the point at which they began to understand the nature of their situation. Cole was on the north wall when he heard it. He almost missed it. The noise of the battle at that hour was considerable and his attention was on a very specific coordination problem involving the eastern flank and a gap in communication that Ruth's second was working to close. He was in the middle of a sentence when the sound arrived. Very small. Very clear. From below the wall. From inside the compound. He finished the sentence. He made the decision about the eastern flank. He handed the coordination to Ruth's second and he came down off the wall. He was moving through the inner corridor toward the east wing when he met Faye coming the other way, and the look on her face stopped him for 1/2 second before he read it correctly. Not emergency. Not emergency. He breathed. How long? He said. 3 hours, Faye said. She did not want me to send for you until I could tell you both were stable. He looked at her. Both, she said. He walked past her. He took the stairs to the east wing two at a time, which was not entirely dignified, and he did not care, and he pushed open the door at the end of the corridor and came into the room. The room was warm. There were candles. Outside the window, the sounds of the battle had moved away from the eastern side, which meant Ruth had done what Ruth had said she would do, which surprised no one. Lena was sitting up against the pillows with the particular careful stillness of someone who has just done something enormous and is still inside the enormity of it. Her face was pale and her eyes were very clear, the way eyes get when a person is tired all the way through and awake all the way through at the same time. She was looking at the bundle in her arms, and she did not look up when he came in. He walked to the chair beside the bed. He sat down. He still had his coat on. He still had the broken sword from the north wall in his hand, he realized, and he looked at it for a moment and set it on the floor beside the chair. He looked at Lena. She looked up at him then. She looked at him for a moment, taking in the coat and the battle and what was still visible on his face from 4 days of war, and she looked back down at what was in her arms. She held it out to him. He took her. She was so small that for a moment he did not know how to hold something that small, and then he did, some older knowledge arriving from somewhere he had not known it was stored, and he held her against his chest and looked at her face. He held her for a long time without speaking. Outside, Ruth's forces pushed the last of the western pack back from the outer wall. He heard it distantly, the shift in the noise that meant the weight of the thing had tipped, that the outcome was written now even if the last words had not been spoken. He did not move. He kept looking at the child. After a long time he said, very quietly, "I did not destroy it." Lena was quiet. He said, "The kingdom. I did not destroy it to save you." She looked at him. He met her eyes over the child between them, and the candles and the pale window and the sound of a battle finishing outside were all present, and none of them were the point, and he said, "I destroyed what was not worth keeping." The room was still. She looked at him for a long moment, with her careful face and her clear eyes and all the things she had been doing with her thoughts for the 3 years and the 60 miles and the fence post and the torn document. She said nothing. He had not expected her to. She looked back at the child, and he looked back at the child, and the fire in the grate kept going, and outside the window, the morning was beginning to arrive in the way it always arrives, slowly and without asking anyone's permission, spreading itself over the hills and the walls and the courtyard below. It spread over the broken sword on the floor. It spread over the pieces of things that used to be walls. In the corridor outside the door, Faye sat on a bench with a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked at nothing in particular, and she thought about the word strong, and she thought that she had been right about that, and she was glad. The child slept. The morning came. In the east wing, with the warmth and the quiet and the long night finished, Lena held the thought she had been keeping for 60 miles. The thought she had not said out loud to anyone, not in the code and not in the crawl and not in the entrance hall and not in the archive corridor. She held it in her chest where it had been living, quiet and very certain, and she looked at Cole looking at the child, and she let the thought do what it had been waiting to do. She let it be true,